Following the testing of the previously successful Me-163A series, the Germans began developing a new, improved version for operational military use. This would lead to the Me-163B series, which was the first and last rocket-powered aircraft to be used in active combat. In comparison to its predecessor, the Me-163B offered a number of improvements to its design and shape. By the war's end, less than 400 aircraft of this type would be built. Work on the second series of the Me-163B, which would be built in greater numbers than the experimental A series, began at the start of September 1941. It was estimated by the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, that after the first batch of 70 aircraft was built, it would take some 7 months to actually begin mass production. As was the case with many German wartime projects, this was optimistic, and the project suffered from delays, mainly from a lack of resources. The work on the initial group of prototypes started only at the end of 1941. Once again, further delays due to the slow delivery of engines postponed production until March of 1942. In May of 1942, the first Me-163B prototype was completed, but as it lacked the engine, it was tested as an unpowered glider. By 1943, it was obvious that Messerschmitt alone could not cope with the wartime demands. So RLM officials decided to bring aboard another aircraft manufacturer. They chose Klem's Stuttgart-Böblingen factory. In September 1944, the production of the Me-163B was officially handed over to yet another company, Junkers. In order to avoid concentrating the production in one location, given the Allied bombing campaign, Junkers dispersed it across numerous smaller companies. Each of these was tasked with the delivery and production of parts before being finally assembled at Brandenburg-Brest. This, in theory, would increase the overall production and avoid being completely shut down by Allied bombers. In reality, it backfired, as it caused huge confusion and chaos with the delivery of parts and poor quality in production. At this point of the war, due to a lack of manpower, the Germans used mass slave labor, which also affected the production quality of many projects, including the Me-163. By the end of the war, some 370 aircraft of this version would be built. The Me-163B was quite a unique aircraft design, the most obvious innovation that separates it from any other aircraft design used during the Second World War was the use of a rocket engine and, more importantly, its fuel. During its development, the Me-163B was tested with a series of different rocket engines. Ultimately, for the main production version, the HWK-509A rocket engine was chosen. This aircraft initially used a fuel mixture of T and C-Stoff. T-Stoff consists of a mix of hydrogen peroxide with oxyquinoline or phosphate. C-Stoff was a mix of methyl alcohol, hydrazine hydrate, and water. T-Stoff was stored in one main and two smaller auxiliary tanks, placed on both sides of the cockpit. The C-Stoff tanks were placed in the Me-163's wings. These chemicals were extremely flammable and dangerous to handle, and thus required safety procedures to be used properly. Before each flight and during refueling, the fuel tanks, ground, and aircraft had to be thoroughly washed with water. If the safety procedures were not followed, there is a great risk of explosion, which happened on occasion. Due to the volatile nature of the fuel, any harsh landing with fuel still on board offered a great chance of explosion as well, which led to a number of pilots being lost. Being highly corrosive and deadly to the touch, the maintenance crews and pilots had to wear specially designed protective clothing and gloves, but preserved photographs seem to indicate that these precautions were not always strictly adhered to. Given that the Me-163B operated in late 1944, when shortages of all kinds of equipment and materials were common, this should not come as a surprise. Still, handling the Me-163B's fuel without this kind of protection was highly dangerous for the ground maintenance crews. The Me-163B was notorious for having only a limited powered flight endurance of 7 minutes and 30 seconds before its fuel reserve was spent. The actual flight could be much longer, however, since with sufficient altitude the pilot could switch off the engine and reactivate it as needed. After all rocket fuel had been spent, the pilot would then use the Me-163B as a glider to fly back to its base or to any nearby German airfield. Another unusual feature was the lack of a traditional landing gear unit. This was mainly done to reduce the overall weight of the aircraft. Takeoffs and landings were divided into two phases. For takeoff, the Me-163 sat on a simple two-wheel dolly unit. Once at sufficient altitude, the dolly was jettisoned from the bottom of the aircraft. On occasion, there were accidents involving this system when, for example, the dolly refused to release from the aircraft, or even worse, it could bounce off the ground and strike the aircraft from below. On landing, the Me-163 was to use a simple retractable landing skid placed beneath the fuselage. While this takeoff and landing system offered the desired reduction in weight, it was not without its problems. After a successful landing, the Me-163B was immobile and vulnerable to possible enemy attacks. To move it across the airfield, the Germans designed and built a small specialized aircraft tug called the Scheuchschlepper. The initial armament consisted of two 20mm MG-151 cannons, which were positioned in the wing roots. In order to increase the firepower against bombers, these would be replaced with 30mm Mk-108 cannons. While the Mk-108 had sufficient firepower to outright destroy or heavily damage enemy aircraft, it was hindered by its low muzzle velocity. This, combined with the extraordinary speed of the Me-163B, made engaging targets difficult. For this reason, the Me-163 was tested with some experimental weapon systems. These included the 5.5cm R-4M air-to-air rocket and the more revolutionary SG-500 Jagdfaust. This weapon consisted of 5 rockets, usually placed under each wing, but on the Me-163B actually mounted vertically in the wings. It was provided with an optical sensor that activated its weapon load, in theory once it detected the shadow of an enemy plane. As the first aircraft was slowly completed, they were allocated to the Erprobungskommandos 16 unit from April of 1942 onward. By May of 1944, only a small number of fewer than 50 pilots had a chance to fly either the powered or towed version of the Me-163B. An interesting episode of this unit's history is connected to the well-known German test pilot Hanna Reitsch. After a number of attempts to get permission to flight test the Me-163B, she was finally allowed to do so at the end of 1942. Shortly after she took off, the jettisonable takeoff dolly refused to successfully detach from the aircraft, preventing it from using the landing skid. She managed to land the aircraft but was badly wounded and was placed in a hospital for some time. She later requested permission to fly the Me-163B again, but this was explicitly rejected and she was forbidden from flying it. Another interesting story related to this unit was the combat action conducted on the 14th of May 1944 by Major Spate. Prior to the first flight, his Me-163 aircraft was painted in red. This was done by the unit mechanics who wanted this small gesture to bring good luck to their pilots. Seeing no harm in it, Major Spate gave instructions that his aircraft be fully fueled and armed. During his flight, he attempted twice to attack Allied bombers, but failed to properly engage them. It seems the red paint did not help with his luck or invoke the spirit of the Red Baron. The first operational unit to be equipped with the Me-163 was the Jagdgeschwader 400 at the start of 1944. It received its first Me-163 on the 10th of March, and 7 more were meant to arrive by late April 1944. The Me-163 was then used in several failed attempts to intercept the Allied reconnaissance aircraft that made frequent flights over the base. At the same time, the JG-400 and other available Me-163s were being relocated to new positions at Brandis. It is from there that the Me-163s attempted to intercept a huge Allied air formation of some 766 bombers, supported by over 14 groups of cover fighters. In the end, they did not engage the Allies, probably due to the small number of available aircraft and the heavy fighter cover. By the end of July, the JG-400 had only 4 operational aircraft out of the 16 available. In mid-August, Me-163s from this unit attacked an Allied B-17 bomber formation. While evading the fighter cover, they managed to heavily damage at least one bomber. On the 16th of August, 5 Me-163s attacked a group of B-17s and managed to shoot down 2 of the bombers. The Germans lost 1 Me-163 during this engagement after being hit by an Allied P-51. On the 24th of August, 8 Me-163s managed to shoot down 3 more bombers while successfully evading enemy fighter cover. Given the previous successes in destroying 5 enemy bombers with a limited number of available Me-163s, attempts were made to increase the number of squadrons equipped with this aircraft. This was never achieved as the Allies destroyed the vital Seestoff fuel production facility at Kiel in August. On the 11th of September, a single Me-163 attacked and destroyed a lone B-17. During these initial combat engagement with the Allied bombers, German pilots noticed that the Me-163's armament had a huge flaw. The weapons were difficult to use with the standard attack tactics of the aircraft, as it involved getting the Me-163 high above the Allied bombers and then plunging down on them with a dive speed of 885 to 930 km per hour. Due to its main cannon's low velocity, and in order to avoid collision with the target, the pilot had only a few seconds available to engage the enemy. This meant that only a highly experienced Me-163 pilot had a chance of hitting the enemy aircraft. At the end of September 1944, a few more units were formed, but few sorties were carried out, mostly due to a lack of fuel. In November of 1944, an Me-163 engaged a British Mosquito, damaging it and forcing its crew to abandon the aircraft. Bad weather, lack of fuel, and the rapid Allied advance in the west and east temporarily stopped all Me-163 combat operations until March of 1945. An interesting air victory was achieved on the 10th of April 1945 when a British Lancaster bomber was shot down after being hit by the SG-500 Jagdfaust. At least 5 more Allied aircraft were destroyed by the end of the war, but the chronic lack of fuel and the rapid Allied advance put an end to the Me-163B's operational service life. Despite being instructed to destroy their own aircraft to prevent them from falling into the enemy's hands, the Allies managed to capture around 50 or so Me-163s. Some 25 were transported back to the UK to be properly examined. The Americans also managed to capture a number of Me-163s in various working conditions across occupied Germany. The French Air Force received at least 4 aircraft from the British after the war. The Soviets were not idle either, as they also managed to acquire an unknown number, including the rare 2-seater trainer version designated Me-163S. In 1944, a number of previously secret projects were meant to be shared with the Japanese. For this reason, several submarines were sent to transport parts of a disassembled Me-163B to Japan. While the one carrying the aircraft parts was sunk, the others carrying the technical manuals managed to reach the Axis ally. Based on these, the Japanese managed to build a slightly modified copy of the Me-163. During the first test flight, there was an accident in which the prototype was lost. This concludes our look at the Me-163B. What do you think about this first and only operational rocket-powered aircraft? Would you have flown this thing given the chance? Let us know in the comments. If you like what we do and want to see more, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. Also, don't forget to take a look at our extensive collection of articles on our website, plane-encyclopedia.com. Thank you.